How We Won by Charlotte T. Zitlow, Part 3. We won. Now what do we do? Chapter 14, Preparing to Govern. In the 2 months after the campaign and the surprising and unexpectedly large victory, the real work came into clear focus. There was new research to be done, new people to talk to, thank yous to be extended, bridges to rebuild. We were to become the government of the people of Bloomington, and we took that very seriously. There were those with whom we had had major personal differences, and many with whom we had merely disagreed. They were all now our constituents because of our deep-seated values and mindsets. We newly elected were almost overwhelmingly conciliatory. Some of us harbored grudges, but most did not, and it was making sure that we were reaching out and listening to the entire community that became the goal. Reality set in as we neared the day of being sworn in, New Year's Day, 1972. It was exhilarating and daunting, but we thought, ready. In 1972, the film The Candidate was widely distributed and well-reviewed. It tells the story of Bill McKay, played by Robert Redford, who runs an uphill campaign for U.S. Senate and quite unexpectedly wins. The last moments of the film show Robert Redford looking like a deer in the headlights, asking, "Now what do I do?" We were not quite deer in the headlights, but we had some sense of the feeling. We were elected, now we had to govern. It was a heavy responsibility. Our agenda was clearly laid out, but we now had to turn it into reality. How should we begin? While we were committed to opening up the government to all citizens, we also promised to have a professional staff. We began to list the steps we had to take to appoint people with only 2 months between the election and swearing in. Who, in fact, did the mayor have the sole authority to appoint? Who did he not? Rereading existing state statutes and city ordinances, we began to understand that the city planner had to be hired by the Plan Commission. The Board of Public Safety had a say in who would be fire chief and chief of police. The city council at that time had the authority to set salaries for police and fire. There were few civil servants in the traditional sense, but there were a number of staff that had institutional memory, which we would need. How does one go about hiring a city engineer? No doubt the mayor could hire his own executive assistant, office staff, and a city controller. There was no in-house city attorney, only one who had been on retainer part-time, James Cotner, and he had recently resigned. The position of deputy mayor did not exist. Where would the city council hang its hats and coats? Surely this independent group, as we forged a new concept of activist council, would no longer find the mayor's couch acceptable. What kind of say would the council have in advising the mayor on all these choices? How would we negotiate the checks and balances prescribed by state law but not implemented for many administrations? The 2% club that required government employees to pay 2% of their wages to a charity fund to be used, in fact, for political purposes, which Indiana was the last state to abolish, sounded abhorrent to us. We made a conscious decision not to continue it here. It was the first actual diversion from the status quo that we acted on, and it was not without pushback from elements of the local Democratic Party. The custom of both parties heretofore had been to the victor go the spoils. We also made it publicly clear that boards and commissions were not going to be filled only with our own best friends and relations. We were dedicated to having citizens participate according to their interest, experience, and expertise. And then there were all the issues on the agenda that we had spelled out so painstakingly. Who would draft the ordinances we conceived? And what was the appropriate format? Who, in fact, would type the drafts? What typewriter would be used? Since traditionally the council had no staff, who would physically prepare the council agenda? The election of Grace Johnson as city clerk ensured that minutes of the council meetings would be much more informative and accurate. But would she also act as a sort of secretary to the council? Probably not, we all concluded. We discovered in time that Gladys Van Hook showed up to do some of the clerical work. We had had no idea that such a person existed in this role. We had to meet her and find out what her role had been, what we could expect her to keep on doing, and what she could help with us to understand. She was patient, and we were relieved and grateful. November and December were devoted to these questions. For the motley crew of neophytes that had just won the responsibility to run the city, election night was given over to joy and anticipation. By morning, we realized that we had a city to run, but we knew we would do our best, listening, studying, researching, digging in. For me, that meant reading everything, council minutes, plans, budgets. For all of us, it meant learning precisely what was happening in every department, getting a clear picture of who was doing what and how well. We also needed to determine which of us would be council officers, the most urgent of whom would be the council president. The leading candidate soon became me. I had campaigned daily, citywide, and I had done an extraordinary amount of research and expended a huge amount of time and energy. Furthermore, since I had been, after all, designated somehow inferior, and as a mere housewife, it was assumed I had time to do what was going to be a lot of work. All of this led to that decision by a gradually developed consensus that PhD housewife was elected president. Within weeks, Mayor-elect Frank McCloskey had designated a corporation counsel, James Register, a seasoned attorney and a lifelong Bloomingtonian. His maternal family, the Sewards, had reputedly crafted the mysterious fish weather vane on top of the courthouse. Jimmy, as we called him, was totally focused on annexation, an issue that had been plaguing the city for years. He had done a mountain of spade work during the campaign, strategizing with Ice Miller, Donato, and Ryan, the leading municipal bond law firm in Indiana at the time, and was ready to go. Jimmy's team concluded that it would be most expeditious to break up the annexation efforts into discrete parcels. Taxation for the larger properties, it was proposed, would be phased in, starting with a small percentage and increasing to the full rate over 10 years. The revenues would be placed in escrow and then be designated to infrastructure improvements for the industrial area. This was a monumental task, but meticulously thought out. Plans would be ready to launch on January 1. Every parcel would be dealt with individually, bit by bit. In addition, given the anticipated level of legal activity that the administration and council foresaw, a second city attorney was selected. Larry Owens, another Bloomington native whose brother Sam was a prominent local developer and most likely a Republican, was chosen from a long list of applicants. John Irvine, a hard-working attorney who had done work with labor unions in Bedford and served for several years as counsel to the Indiana Human Rights Commission, was selected by Frank McCloskey as executive assistant. His job was to help define and implement the administrative structure. Martha Ellen Sims, who owned and ran Bloomington Abstract and was one of the few women business owners in town, was named to the critical post of city controller, the person who manages all aspects of the city financial systems and transactions. An advertised search for a certified licensed city engineer led to the appointment of Rasul Istribaldi. Istribaldi had immigrated with his family from Iraq. He had earned his civil engineering degrees from the University of Michigan, was exceptionally qualified as a city engineer, and was totally apolitical. An experienced writer, Tom Holdenfield, was hired as the first public relations assistant to the mayor. And perhaps the single most important appointment for the young Mayor McCloskey was the choice of Jim Ray Jr. to head the Department of Public Works and all other duties as needed. Jim was a recent graduate of the IU School of Business, a native of Bloomington, and an ambitious and entrepreneurial problem solver who knew the community well and quickly became the mayor's go-to advisor for many city issues. These were all individuals whose positions were essential to the effective management of the city and who had been individuals in whom the mayor had both trust and confidence. And like the new administration and council, they were new in their post, but almost everyone had strong and time-honored ties to the community. They accepted the positions with enthusiasm, knowledge, and integrity, and gradually earned the confidence of the community as well. Mayor-elect McCloskey focused on identifying and meeting with his closest administrative support staff. Simultaneously, the council, as individuals and as a team, zeroed in on what steps were necessary to turn our promises into programs. On many of the relatively few boards and commissions that existed at the time, there was a seat, either official or ex officio, for members of the council. Jim Ackerman attended meetings of the Parks and Recreation Commission and the two animal control organizations, the Monroe County Humane Association and the City Animal Control Board. Sherwin Meisel, having the consent of the council to serve on the Plan Commission upon taking office, spent more time immersing himself in the specifics of the proposed JJ&R package and the existing ordinances, as well as the Indiana statute outlining the powers of Plan Commission members. Owl Toll became even more familiar with the existing housing code and enforcement policies and practices. Wayne Fix researched environmental initiatives in other communities and potential for recycling in Bloomington. Hubert Davis steeped himself in the practices, costs, and efficiency of sanitary services and street department activities. Brian De St. Croix carefully constructed his groundbreaking proposal for a manpower task force. Dick Behan got acquainted with the Drug Commission, its track record, the limitations of its current programs, and the potential for improvement. I accepted the role of social services liaison and began long-term involvement with the Monroe County Community Action Program, the Community Mental Health Center, and the 4Cs, Community Coordinated Child Care Organization. We embarked on crash courses in all the details of the subjects that had interested each of us most, and we discussed and planned for the inclusion of the community in the deliberations and oversight and expansion of the Human Rights Ordinance. In addition, the whole council and the mayor's team studied the budget, looking at priorities and making recommendations for shifting budget items around to reflect our priorities. It was clear to all of us that implementation of ordinances and programs required concerted efforts of the staff. While the city budget showed little flexibility, we discovered a goldmine of new work-study program, a federally supported plan to pay a substantial portion of wages for college students to work in approved positions while continuing to work on their degrees. The work-study program was a product of President Johnson's War on Poverty and had been around for several years, but Bloomington local government had not even explored the possibility of using it. The selection process for naming these students was rigorous, and the students we were able to recruit had an outstanding record of performance in their positions. The Great Society/War on Poverty programs had shifted attention from local government to the federal, especially in terms of funding. However, the federal programs were specifically aimed at reviving local economies, improving local infrastructure, empowering local human rights, creating local businesses with an aim to increase local employment, and, it stated, to do whatever it took to fight poverty. This grand scheme had been developed by Johnson administration with the cooperation of comfortable Democratic majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Republicans on many levels reacted predictably with vehement skepticism and hostility. Monroe County and City of Bloomington Republican administrations were no exception. They issued federal dollars, scoffed at federal initiatives. One of the significant moves of the new city government was immediately beginning to research available federal funds and programs for housing, infrastructure, social services challenges, and environmental concerns. We learned that there were many opportunities that had been turned down or ignored by our predecessors, which we immediately started to reconsider. Here were dollars that could be applied to specific problems. Together with the work-study program, these were a godsend. Footnote: many of our early work-study students went on to illustrious careers. One assistant to the mayor, Clarine Nardi Riddle, became Attorney General of Connecticut, researching, asking questions to anyone who might be knowledgeable about the city, going through minutes and documents and reports in the IU library, discussing options, discovering context. We were busy in the time before the swearing-in ceremonies. We were getting to know each other and to understand the enormity of the task we had to do. By the first of the year, we were ready to start governing, although we knew we had a long way to go to feel comfortable in our new positions.